Biblical math is an interesting subject. People use it for all sorts of purposes. Figuring out how old certain characters are at different stages in their stories, figuring out when in history, or proto-history, we can place certain events, even figuring out how old our people is. The year 5777 isn't just some arbitrary number, it's a number which was calculated by the rabbis long ago after looking at various numbers and generations listed in the Torah text and basically doing one very, 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 very long addition problem. Knowing the dates of things, I think, is important. Knowledge of when things happened colors our understanding of those events. You know, you hear an older person say a word which is today considered taboo in our society, and so often the response is, oh, they just come from a different time, or it's a generational thing. And certainly the reverse is just as common. I heard a teenager in the Congregation Etz where I work the other day, try to explain to one of their grandparents about how lame the Instagram feed one of the kids in their math class was. And Grandma Dolores, I don't know what her name is, but Grandma replies tacitly saying, "What's Instagram?" These situations are obviously somewhat dramatized, but the point remains. Understanding when something happens or how long it took to happen affects how we think about that event, or in some cases, the events of a person's life. The life which is this Shabbat under the microscope, under examination, is the life of Noah, one of the first people in the Torah to commune with God. And what a life it is! 950 years, or so says the Torah. For the nerds among us, the nerds in the room, that's even older than Yoda when he dies at the end of Star Wars, but I digress. There's a lot of important numbers associated with Parshat Noach. Let's see if we can fill in some blanks. It's congregational participation time. God told Noah that it was going to rain for days and nights. 40 days and 40 nights. Bingo. Noah had to round up how many of each animal? Two. They came on the ark 2 by 2. And how many of each kosher animal? 7. Bingo. Right? These are the most important, or at least the most apparent and well-known numbers we see in the story. But there's more math that needs to be done here. Most of us think the flood and the Noah story, we think of it as being 40 days and 40 nights long. But that understanding is actually a bit misleading. We might need a calculator, but don't worry, I've done some of the math at home already. It's like a cooking show where I have one ready to go in the oven. Well, I've done the math at home already. The Torah tells us that in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of that month, on that very day, all the fountains of the great deep broke open, and the windows of heaven were opened. So from that first day, it was another 40 days until the rain stopped. Those 40 days of rain were followed by another 150 days in which the water was still swelling and churning. After which, and this is the translation straight from the Torah, God remembered Noach and every living thing and all the cattle that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind pass over the earth, and the waters were assuaged and began to subside. So far we're at 190 days, way more than 40 already. So it was 16 days later, after those 150 days, that the ark made landfall on the mountains of Ararat. And it took another 44 days for the mountain peaks to become visible. So that puts us so far at 250 days, pretty long way away from that 40 with which we started. But the math doesn't stop there. Noah had to wait another 40 days after the ark landed before sending the raven out to test the conditions of the flooded world. And when the raven was uncooperative, another week later, Noah sent the dove. And the dove experiment, from initial flight to return with olive branch, takes yet another 2 weeks. But Noah didn't leave the ark right then and there when the dove comes back with the olive branch. It wasn't until the first day of the first month, which by then was, if I did my math at home correctly, 307 days after the rains began, that the water was completely drained, right? That it wasn't until 307 days that there was no more water all over the earth. But then after that, it still took another 57 days for the surface of the earth to dry completely from the flood. And then finally on the day after, the 58th day, that was when Noah steps out of the ark and God commands the whole family to leave. And so if we did our math right, is anyone following along?
Yes.
Right? What a surprise. The flood, from start to finish, takes a clean and even 365 days, a full solar year. The flood story then, if taken for the fullness of length, from start to finish, it's not so simply a story of destruction, right? It's a story of an only slightly longer than a month destructive time in which nothing but badness happens on the earth, followed by a slow and steady walking back of that damage over the course of the rest of the year. A lot can happen in a year, even just 1 year. We only just finished our holiday cycle, and we spent those days talking and thinking about our lives from the previous year until now. What has changed? What has stayed the same? What's been broken down? What's been built back up? The story of Noah, unlike the High Holy Days, seems to me, to be instructing us not to look at our year as a series of events, but rather to consider the year as a whole. Yes, the flood had many different stages and components, but the story pushes its reader to consider the before and the after of an entire year's events. What was the world like before the flood? Full of violence, hateful speech, sin, brothers and sisters fighting against one another. And then what was it after? Clean, unblemished by human failures, a blank canvas, ready for the architect of creation and God's partners in Noah and his family to begin their work anew. Another cycle is coming to a close in just a couple of days, the election cycle. And this has been, not unlike the flood, one of the most destructive election cycles in recent memory. Comparing the way those of differing backgrounds or mindsets or political bends spoke to one another before the Bernie versus Clinton and the Trump versus Cruz and the Trump versus Clinton schisms arose in our society to the way discourse functions now. It's almost like night and day. Us, you and me, your friendly neighborhood American citizens, have been hiding on our arks for the past year, trying to ride out the storm. Here and there, getting word from messengers, like the raven or the dove. Not so much doves, but maybe perhaps pundits or journalists could be our messengers, about what things are like in the outside world, outside of our little bubbles, outside of our arcs. But just like behind any storm cloud, there remains a silver lining. The one thought that I'm holding on to in the waning days of this year, this election year, as the grounds beneath us approach their normative dry state once again, is that November 9th is a new day. For better or worse, the arguments and debates will be over. And we as a society will have the chance to begin anew the work of building up our country, of mending and patching those tears in the fabric of America that this past year, these harsh words and cruel criticisms have rent. Just as God made a pact with Noah never again to destroy the world that way, so must we reach toward our brothers and sisters and find the rainbow that marks our collective desire not to see such destruction ever again. November 9th is the day which will mark the beginning of peace talks with those of us with whom we've spent a year arguing. And for me, it's no coincidence that this Shabbat, the Shabbat just before this long year ends, is the one on which we read of the dove and the olive branch she carried. So may it be God's will that as we conclude a year of tumultuousness, we use this Shabbat to seek out that olive branch of peace. We turn ahead to